Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again another about 45 pages, 50 pages of U.S. hands-off the Mideast. Cuba speaks out at the United Nations, a book by Fidel Castro and RICARDO ALARCON on the Iraq-Kuwait conflict and Washington's war moves. So we are going to talk a few things. Again, the restricted access. We discussed yesterday that I had restricted access, but now all of the PDFs are available in the description section for the book. So if you were unable to download it because of an access restriction, it has now been fixed. So please download the books. You can go to the website. You can go to the YouTube video, go to the description section, and then just copy and paste the Google Drive link in the description section. So we're going to get started. Yesterday, we talked somewhat about Donald Trump at the International Court of Justice. Its setting in Geneva basically should excuse Trump. The settling of the Geneva conference should excuse Trump for racist war crimes of colonialism and war criminal action. This is, even propagated in the U.S., academia, the fraud academia. It's a fraud academics. The American academia is frauds. They're liars. They're frauds. They're, just garbage men, garbage liars, garbage propagators of, deceit news. It's a disinformation, a state censorship system. Their media and academia both constitute a state censorship system and a state disinformation campaign. And everything is just disinformation. The media fraud is disinformation and state censorship. And the academia is disinformation and state censorship. So with respect to, Donald Trump, many university scholars in America discuss the fact that, Donald Trump is not, prosecutable according to the ICC. That's all fraud. He's committed crimes against humanity. He's committed acts of genocide. He's committed acts of, war crimes. He has destroyed civilian infrastructure. He has done all sorts of, action. He has committed the criminal war of aggression. All of this stuff are, basically within the purview of the ICJ. Now, that's one thing. But the second thing is that the European ICJ is in Portugal. It is a Portuguese place. It is in the Netherlands, in The Hague. So you can see why it's a racist organization. Portugal was the most brutal of colonial butchers. They're the most brutal of colonial, colonial mafia thugs. They are racist Europeans to the core. And that is why the ICJ is a racist organization of fraud European whites. They would never prosecute a white man in this organization because it is a fraud group. It is a fraud group. It is a liar group. It is stationed in Portugal. And that is where, all of the colonialism originated. It was a fascist, brutal regime, the most brutal colonial regime ever in the history of the world. Comparable only to American colonialism. Only American colonialism compares to Portuguese colonialism. And those are the facts. And that is what, we're going to say about it. The other thing is that it's also important that even though in many ways the ICJ is a fraud organization, it is the responsibility of the governments that are victims of American imperialism to report the crimes that they have been victimized by. If you do not report it, if, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, if it does not report these crimes that the United States has committed, then they are not, they're not, fulfilling their responsibility to the third world. Because if these crimes are not reported and docketed with the ICJ, even if the ICJ ignores them, which the ICJ is oftentimes, I'm not going to tell you that the ICJ is an organization that's trustworthy or credible. They're a group of fraud liar Europeans. It's a European fraud organization. It's a colonial organization of pro-Yankee frauds. So they support Yankee butchery, Yankee propaganda, Yankee lies and deceit, Yankee press fabrications. All of it is supported by, Portugal and the Netherlands and the ICJ. But I'm telling you that even if that is the case, even if that they do not, prosecute Donald Trump and do not, enact justice in this case, they still will note the complications and they will be discussed. Any criminal action by the U.S. government will be discussed in the public sphere. So please report any crimes that have happened. Any victim of American criminal aggression needs to report those crimes to the ICJ and needs to docket a case with the ICJ, whether or not it's successful. It's unfortunate, but even if it's not successful, it's not worth, hiding the stuff because the these are, criminal actions, and murder of, any kind of third world people by the Yankee imperialist butchers and rapists of the U.S. government is definitely required for you to report. You have to report that stuff. You have to report the crimes against humanity that the U.S. government has performed. And they've done it all across the board. And they're lying, government. They're lying government, and they're fabricating media. They're delusional and hallucinatory media. It's not just the wars. They're just a generally fraudulent organization. The U.S. press is generally a fraudulent group of whites. They are fraudulent regarding domestic issues, regarding international issues, regarding everything. The American press, the U.S. mass media are fraudulent. They are fraudulent. They are liars. They are deceitful. They are con artists. That is the U.S. press. That is their ethics. That is because they are unethical whites. They are unethical Yankees. And that is why they are it's a unethical press. It's a highly unethical, immoral press. And there's no sense in following them and listening to them. So that's the other thing. So basically, we talked about Portugal, basically genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Prosecutable, probably might not be prosecuted, but still report them because it's important to, make sure that it's discussed at a government level so that the U.S. government and the public sphere will be knowledgeable of the American criminal Yankee actions. Okay, we also talked about UNESCO. UNESCO is very relevant to the press. It's relevant to the press. It's relevant to the Yankee imperialism. Okay, basically, my statement is, get out, Yankee, you murderous, anti-Hispanic American and anti-Asian butcher Yankee. That is my statement about the U.S., entry into the UNESCO in 2023. Basically, the U.S. government in 1984 withdrew from UNESCO after waging a propaganda war in the Reagan administration for 4 years with the pretext of getting out of the organization. They didn't like the third world autonomy. They didn't like political equality for the third world. They wanted a majority opinion, a white European Western majority opinion in a democratic organization. The typical white unethical thug Yankees that run, all of the organization. They are unethical thug Yankees. They wanted a one-sided Western propaganda organization of UNESCO for the sake of their own personal, imperialism and the Western colonialism. But they didn't get it. UNESCO put up a fight. The third world put up a fight, and then they withdrew. They said they were going to withdraw. They didn't want to pay them any money. They wanted to get out. Then they were out for 37 years, and then they rejoined in 2023. Well, for what reason? Because they wanted to recolonize. They want to subvert this organization. They want to secretly, unethically deal with this organization. They're racist Yankee butchers. After, getting out and then getting back in, the Yankees have the nerve to attack Iran, to kidnap Maduro, and to, unleash a sovereign blockade against Cuba. All actions of a government of frauds, a government of deceitful liars. You get out, Yankee, is our statement. Get out of UNESCO, Yankee. You are not wanted. You should stay in your white racist clubs and do your white racist colonialism. You can commit any kind of butchery from your white racist clubs. Why pollute an organization intended for third world literacy, medicine, and food equality? Why promote a racist group of white Yankee thug butchers to be in an organization that's meant to for equality and racial justice? Your president isn't equal justice. Your Congress doesn't care about equal justice. So get out of the organization and keep it in America. Keep America the racist thug Yankees that they've always been. So that's that. We talked about Nicolas Maduro. Nicolas Maduro was captured by the U.S. government. It was a Yankee thug invasion, a racist invasion by the colonial criminal Yankee butchers of the U.S. government. We also talked about the Cuba blockade. It's an illegal blockade. And again, we are strongly suggesting the United States not do anything with Cuba because you would certainly be at risk for prosecution in the International Court of Justice. Absolutely concerning that everyone should be aware that the U.S. government could certainly be prosecuted for war crimes and criminal aggression if they do anything in an invasion of Cuba. Put it at notice, Donald Trump could be arrested and could not ever be allowed to travel to Europe. So remember that. That's a dangerous risk for the U.S. government to take if they do anything with respect to Cuba. That's my statement. That's my statement. I strongly believe that the ICJ will support justice if the United States does a Cuban intervention. So be careful, Yankee. Be careful. Donald Trump could have an arrest warrant, and then he couldn't visit his casinos, right? He needs to go to his casinos. He needs to schmooze with, the whites of Europe. And, he might be in a signatory country that wouldn't allow him to travel. So it would be very inconvenient for Donald Trump to be able to visit the countries, when he's, being, arrest warranted by the ICJ. So that's that. So basically, colonial criminal grabs we talked about. Basically trickster Yankee and censorship Yankee press. Basically, the American press is a trickster press. It's a censorship press. It's a state censorship, system. It is a state authoritarian system of censorship. It is not a press. It is not a free press. It is a restricted press, a restricted elite corporate press of state censorship. There is no free flow of information. There is no free flow of ideas. There is no democratic thought. It is all unethical. It is all unethical censorship press. It is what the corporate elite want to say. They're basically censorship press. They're a state disinformation press and a lying, unethical group of rich whites. That is all it is. A group of rich whites that are pro-colonialists that lie and fabricate and are unethical and immoral in the press. So that is what you get with the U.S. press. It is a failed press. It is it's a state censorship system. And so finally, we're going to do, those true-false ethics quiz so that Washington can understand the true-false ethics quiz. The ethics quiz is going to include questions on, press as well as, human rights. So let Washington, understand that I know ethics is stupid, but these are simple questions that I'd hope you know the answer to. Otherwise, you're not in the league of civilized nations. Civilized nations should be concerned about you if you can't answer these questions right. So the first question, true-false. New York Times is prestigious and honest journalism. True, false. That's obviously false. New York Times is fraudulent, lies, press, deceitful state censorship, state propaganda. It is a state propaganda system of, government handout media. So second question. Throwing infant Hispanics in the air that are breastfeeding and using them as machine gun target practice is quality moral action, right? Throwing infant Hispanics in the air that are breastfeeding and using them as machine gun target practice is quality moral action. Again, that's false. You cannot throw infants in the air. Third question. Using machetes to remove a black woman's womb and child like eggs out of an iguana is ethical, right? Using machetes to remove a black woman's womb and child like eggs out of iguana is ethical. That's false. You can't do that, but that's what they did in El Salvador. All right. And, one more is high dose electric shock to Muslim women in torture centers is acceptable ethically. So obviously this is another fraudulent statement. It is a false statement. High dose electric shock to Muslim women in torture centers is acceptable ethically. It's false. Washington, I'm not sure what they'd answer. Okay, rape, murder, and cover-up of Asian women is ethically good judgment. All right, rape, murder, and cover-up of Asian women is ethically good judgment. That's false. That's, of course, false. And now we're going to talk about the media deceit and media, honest ethics and morality in American Yankee media, the American U.S. press, their mass media. These questions pertain to that. So please pay attention to these. Racism and deceit in the press is morally acceptable. True, false, true, false. Racism and deceit in the press is morally acceptable. That is false. That is obviously false. It is, false. Second is racism and lying are morally encouraged in press articles, right? Racism and lying are morally encouraged in the press articles. Obviously false. The American press, it's false. They would say true. They would be challenged and they would say true. But, that's the problem with the American press. So it's a major, major problem. The third question. American press is quality moral action because it provides the maximum number of fabrications, right? An American press is quality moral action because it provides the maximum number of fabrications. Obviously, that's false. It's, the quality immoral action because it provides the maximum number of fabrications. Okay, the Yankee press is Pulitzer Prize winning because con artists thrive in it, right? The Yankee press is Pulitzer Prize winning because con artists thrive in it. That's true. Okay, the reason why it's Pulitzer Prize winning is because con artists thrive in it. The New York Times is con artist media. Next, it is ethical to have a racist press fabricate anti-Americanism, right? It is ethical to have a racist press fabricate anti-Americanism. Again, that is false. It is unethical to have a racist press fabricate anti-Americanism. Next question. The U.S. mass media uses racist fraud as its fundamental ethical principle, right? The U.S. mass media uses racist fraud as its fundamental ethical principle. That is true, okay? That is true. The fundamental ethical principle of the U.S. mass media is racist fraud, all right? The New York Times, Washington Post, and Newsweek are ethically good journalism because they encourage fabrication of data, right? The New York Times, Washington Post, and Newsweek are ethically good journalism because they encourage fabrication of data. That is, definitely true, okay? That is definitely false. That is definitely false. They're not ethically good journalism because they encourage fabrication of data. And the American press is quality ethical fraud, right? The American press is quality ethical fraud. That's true. That's true. I would say that's true. So let's, go on. Fabricating numbers in YouTube views to promote a racist fraud perspective is quality ethics, right? Fabricating numbers in YouTube views to promote a racist fraud perspective is quality ethics. That is false. That is false. Fabricating numbers is always, deceitful, but the U.S. press is right up there with, number one in terms of fabrication of numbers. They're fabricating numbers. The last one is, it is ethical press action to fabricate things about competitor countries for your prestige, right? It is ethical press action to fabricate things about competitor countries for your prestige. True, false, that is, false. It is unethical press to fabricate things. But the U.S. press, always fabricational, always making sure prestige is preserved for the, the unprestigious Yankee, butcher mafia. So finally, we have a literacy joke. We want to make a literacy joke. So the world illiteracy problem is combated with American imperial takeover and sending the children out to read the New York Times for half an hour a day. Basically, we said yesterday that is not actually the correct statement. That is not the correct statement. So we're going to, pull the actual statement that I had written. I think that was, pulled over from the prior one. Okay, the world illiteracy problem is combated with American imperialism takeover and sending the children to read Time magazine. And then they're now literate, right? You go to read a press propaganda fraud state censorship magazine of Time, and then you're now literate in English. That's, ultimately, the ultimate lies and the ultimate, fraud. And then finally, we had medical Cuba versus the United States. We talked about Yankee butchers. They create disease in the third world countries through all their wars, kwashiorkor, cholera, diarrheal disease, and various plagues. They then abandon ship like reckless Yankee butchers and thugs and allow the death of the people. That is American medical system and racist U.S. healthcare. So just a little, flavor for, the techniques U.S. healthcare uses to slaughter in the third world. And then finally, Cuban healthcare systematically solves problems in health using science and proper third world concerns and results in excellent outcomes in all of their programs in Africa and Latin America. So that's basically it. We got, through that, and we're going to get started. Page 45, we see preparations for a direct military intervention by the United States and its allies. I'm going to just make a lighting adjustment here. Your Excellency, the following message was sent to Arab heads of state by Fidel Castro, August 7, 1990. I am writing to you because I'm deeply concerned about the events that are now threatening the Arab world and humanity. I firmly believe that at this crucial time, it is still possible for the leaders of the Arab nation to prevent the conflict that broke out between Arab and Kuwait from leading to an adverse situation before the independence of many Arab states, to an economic catastrophe, and to a Holocaust affecting a large portion of their peoples. Such is the threat, as we see it, caused by the growing and accelerated preparations for a direct military intervention by the United States and its allies. No less alarming is the evidence pointing to steps aimed at the creation, for the same interventionist purpose, of a multinational force whose composition reveals a new relationship of forces on a world scale against the interest of the Arab peoples. In its current capacity as temperate members of the Security Council, Cuba did not hesitate to cast its vote in favor of the resolution 660 adopted by the Council August 2nd. Not without pain and bitterness did we take that necessary and just step in line with our principal policy concerning the inadmissibility of resorting to force and military superiority to solve differences among countries, more so when what is involved here is fratricidal confrontation between third world peoples. With both Iraq and Kuwait, we maintain bonds of respect and friendship nurtured by the solidarity of Cuba with the Arab nation and the Palestinian people in the face of Israeli aggression and colonial expansion. Additionally, our historical cooperation in several fields with a number of Arab countries is well known. These principles are, you no doubt understand, are very dear to Cuba, which is permanently threatened with aggression. At the same time, it is our conviction that if there is one thing we should do now, it is to refrain from adding fuel to the fire of war. And it is this conviction that determined our recent abstention in the case of a new Security Council draft resolution sponsored and zealously promoted by the United States, Resolution 661. They want to impose, among other measures, a total economic embargo on Iraq, a step that, in our opinion, lessens the possibility of finding a peaceful solution. The United States and its closest allies are congratulating themselves in this new resolution, which creates ideal conditions for an escalation of the conflict and for the probable use of the most powerful war machinery on the planet. The unmistakable aim is to entrench their domination in the region. To punish Iraq for its regrettable and unacceptable action in Kuwait is just a pretext for the United States. They are looking for an opening to invoke Article 42 of the UN Charter to legitimize armed intervention in the name of the international community. This is the disaster we now face, and there is no one it can be more offensive to than the leaders of the Arab nation. For it is the same Security Council, acting unanimously with the exception of Yemen and Cuba, that by virtue of the U.S. veto proved incapable of condemning, much less establishing sanctions against Israel for its 40-year occupation of Palestine and other Arab states. Thanks also to the anachronistic, unfair, and undemocratic veto privilege and its immoral use by the United States, it has not been possible for the Security Council to condemn Israeli genocide against the heroic Intifada, or the actions of the Zionist army that have caused the deaths of members of the UN forces themselves in Lebanon. It would be naive, and above all, extremely dangerous to give a minimum of credibility to the motivations of the United States claims for playing a leading role in the crisis, with its customary experience in manipulating things, the varied and repeated use of pressure, the military capacity for rapid deployment, and its proven vocation for political opportunism. The U.S. mass media, diplomatic corps, and Pentagon have joined with the Western counterparts to take advantage of the just indignation that Iraq's action against Kuwait instilled in the international community. They are questioning, disqualifying, and blocking any alternative for negotiated political question that is not subordinated to their geopolitical interest, and are wasting no time in deriving as much advantage as they can from the current situation. What won't the United States be capable of doing in a vital region such as this one, unless they are stopped in time? On other occasions, they showed no scruples and slapped the face of the international community by converting a tiny state like Grenada and a country that had already practically occupied like Panama into a shooting range for their most sophisticated weapons. How can anyone fail to see the danger of the United States launching an adventure of this nature when it was capable of planning and launching an air raid against the home of the Libyan president after assuming, without its current backing, the role of international executioner? Can any other conclusions be drawn in view of the landing of the U.S. Marines in Liberia just a few hours ago? Question mark. I am writing to you and other Arab heads of state at this time in the name of the responsibility we all share as members of the movement of non-aligned countries and of the third world. In Cuba, we have confronted mortal dangers, including the threat of nuclear extermination in October 1962. We are well qualified to observe, anticipate, and calmly assess the most dramatic of circumstances. Neither fear nor alarmism is involved here. It so happens in this case that the threat extends to all third world peoples without exception and to the most sensitive aspects of our economies, our security, and our independence. The forces of regression and plunder will not be deterred by the consequences of military intervention if, as the United States hopes, Arabs and Muslims are divided among themselves and bleeding each other dry. The resulting wounds would be so deep that they would require decades to heal. This war would cause widespread destruction in the infrastructure and economies of the Arab countries. They would be turned into the battleground for a war that would not be waged in Europe or the United States, but rather in the Arab-Persian Gulf. This, in turn, would create an economic catastrophe for the entire third world, whose interests ought, in all fairness, to be taken into account at this time. It would be hard to imagine the extent of hardship and exhaustion this would create for the already battered, underdeveloped countries. Oil prices would spiral out of reach for most of these countries, which are already devoid of fuel reserves or the resources to obtain them. It is impossible to overlook, Your Excellency, the tragic irony involved if the United States and its allies in the inglorious crusade fulfill their goals, among them the consolidation of Zionist domination with a minimum loss of life for the West. Their plans, all worked out and tested over time, call for high technology warfare based on the supremacy of their weapons and know-how. The casualties will mostly be sustained by Arab armies and the population involved in the operation. Let us share with you, Your Excellency, the certainty that inspires me of the wisdom and courage of the leaders of the Arab nation and the vitality of its institutions. Nothing and no one can replace the strength, this authority, and this morale in the immediate search for a negotiated solution to a conflict between two Arab peoples. Such a solution would, of course, include withdrawal of Iraqi troops and the full restoration of Kuwait's sovereignty without catastrophic war, immolation of peoples, and vast material destruction. In the same manner, I believe that the movement of non-aligned countries and the United Nations system, with all its flaws and limitations, can buttress the united will of the Arab nation and help it prevail against intervention and aggression. The seriousness and dangers of the present situation demand rapid and effective action by the most prestigious and outstanding leaders of the Arab world. The experience of history more than attests to how dominant powers like the United States are accustomed to imposing accomplished facts and unleashing processes difficult to review. With all due respect and consideration, I exhort you to act with the speed and the risks involved, demand, and with the shortest time possible, overlooking the differences that must now necessarily occupy a second place. I regard this unity of opinion and action as an urgent necessity. Do not doubt even for a second that in this just and noble endeavor, you can count on the support of the overwhelming majority of the international community and, naturally, on the modest cooperation of Cuba. Fraternally, Fidel Castro Ruz, President of the Council of State and of the government of the Republic of Cuba. So, we're going to make some comments. One of the major things to understand, and all of the conflicts, and just generally the United States, the press, the U.S. mass media, is just a group of fabricating liars. It's a state censorship system. It's a state censorship system, a disinformation campaign. It is meant to mislead everyone and to make them think that, just the opposite of what things are. The status quo that they present is just fraud. It is fraud. It is a state censorship system. The only thing that gets out is the fascist viewpoint of the United States government. There is no other viewpoint. There is no democracy. There is no other opinions. The only opinions that are presented in the Western press and the U.S. mass media is their own fascist viewpoint. So there's no sense in reading it. It is a worthless exercise. It is a worthless garbage, communications mode. And it is a worthless garbage enterprise of the U.S. mass media. That's an important fact to know, that never trust the U.S. mass media. It is a garbage media. And that is true with the Western press as well. The Western press often falls right in line with the lie, the state disinformation, the censorship, the state censorship system of the Western media also exists. It is a state censorship system. It is an enterprise of colonial censoring mafia Yankee thugs. That is what it is. It is a worthless piece of garbage. And that's basically it. We talked a lot. Fidel's speech is pretty straightforward, very, very articulate, very, very, well-rounded gentleman. Resolution 662, 1990, Security Council, August 9, 1990. The following resolution was adopted by unanimous vote. The Security Council, recalling its Resolution 660, 1990, and 661, 1990, gravely alarmed by the declaration of Iraq of a comprehensive and eternal merger with Kuwait, demanding once again that Iraq withdraw immediately and unconditionally all its forces to the positions which they were located on August 1st, 1990. Reminded to bring the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq to an end and to restore sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Kuwait. Determined also to reduce the authority of the legitimate government of Kuwait. To decide the annexation of Kuwait by Iraq under any form and whatever pretext has no legal validity and is considered null and void. Calls upon all states, international organizations, and specialized agencies not to recognize that annexation and to refrain from any action or dealing with that might be interpreted as indirect recognition of the annexation. Further demands that Iraq rescind its actions purporting to annex Kuwait. Decides to keep this item on the agenda and to continue its efforts to put an early end to the occupation. Certain powers have sought to use the council as a tool for their own strategic interests. RICARDO, ALARCON, August 9, 1990. The following remarks were made during the discussion of Security Council Resolution 662. I will be brief, since I have, in fact, no real need to explain my delegation's vote. My delegation, when it was first consulted about the situation and the draft resolution, confirmed that we would have no objection to voting in favor of the draft resolution, since we agreed that this decision should be taken at an appropriate time by the council. However, I feel bound to make a number of comments because I have heard some reports that someone, for some unknown reason, is seeking to misinform public opinion and the representatives of the states who are members of the council concerning a supposed Cuban action to prevent or delay the adoption of the draft resolution. As members know, we indicated at informal consultations yesterday that we were ready to vote on the resolution, which we were sure would be adopted unanimously. What my delegation has in fact said in the consultations we have taken part in over the past few days since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 661 is something quite different. We were saying it before Iraqi government's August 8th announcement of the annexation of Kuwait, or even before the intention to do so was made public. I feel duty bound to repeat what I have felt obliged to repeat constantly. Our profound conviction that the Security Council and the international community must act energetically and promptly to prevent the conflict from becoming exacerbated and from spreading. We cannot ignore the obvious fact that certain powers are taking unilateral measures that are not in accordance with the decisions taken by the Council, and, as we noted at an earlier meeting, that do not accord with the desire to maintain the sovereign or territorial integrity of Kuwait or any other state. Such measures simply correspond to the aims of these powers to dominate the Middle East. One cannot justify war and interventionism in the Middle East on the basis of an arbitrary interpretation of the right to self-defense. The world did not come to an end with Mussolini, and the United Nations was born out of the ashes of fascism. And since the United Nations was born, we have seen how certain great powers have sought to use the Council as a tool for their own strategic interests rather than as a body working for the maintenance of international peace and security. I am not going to make a long statement at this point. The last time I spoke before the Council, I call to mind that not 50 or 60 years ago, but here and now, the Council has failed to take meaningful action on other problems that confront us. My delegation will continue to insist that the Council must reject any unilateral selective approach designed solely to benefit great powers. I know that some delegations do not like names to be mentioned, but in this particular case, I am talking respect, especially about the United States of America. A reference has been made, for example, to the importance of monitoring maritime transport routes so as to ensure that an economic and trade embargo is strictly applied. That is fine. My delegation is ready to wait until August 17th. I think we agreed that on August 17th, we would hold the next meeting of the Committee of the Security Council, which was created not last week, but exactly 13 years ago, entrusted with monitoring the implementation of the embargo of arms, not trade, against the South African regime. A few weeks ago, we saw a document from a prestigious non-governmental organization indicating that more than one member of the United Nations and of the Security Council was failing to comply strictly with the provisions of that embargo. The idea has been mentioned of using the naval forces of certain states that have these means available and are willing to provide them to contribute to ensuring that the Committee of the South African Arms Embargo is able to work more effectively. We look forward to receiving proposals along these lines on August 17th. But I think that I should call attention to all members to the fact that it is not the benefit of the immense majority of the humanity to accept the imposition as a practice of the United Nations of these selective approaches based on the priorities of certain quarters. We think, and this is the only point that we have been stressing constantly in the past few days of private consultations, that we must act when the headlines everywhere disclose and announce that there are some who are marching towards war, who are preparing for war, and who are making calculations about the consequences that could have for their forces or military means. We think that it would be very irresponsible of the Security Council not to take this fact into account and not to act immediately. This has nothing to do with the adoption of Resolution 662-1990, which we voted in favor of. I would stress that it is particularly important for us to keep in mind that this serious and disturbing state of affairs in the Middle East region, because at the same time, we have heard today news of something that we trust can open a door to hope in the solution of this deplorable conflict between Iraq and Kuwait and this grave situation prevailing in the region. I am referring to the summit meeting of the Arab states, which should be getting underway in Cairo. In this respect, I should quote the following from a message sent yesterday by Fidel Castro to all the heads of state of the Arab countries, a message that I had the honor of giving personally to Ambassador Mohammed Abulson of Kuwait for transmission to his government. Let me share with you, Your Excellency, the certainty that inspires me of the wisdom and courage of the leaders of the Arab nation and the vitality of its institutions. Nothing and no one can replace this strength, this authority, and this morale in the immediate search for a negotiated solution to the conflict between two Arab peoples. Such a solution would, of course, include the withdrawal of Iraqi troops and the full restoration of Kuwait's sovereignty without catastrophic war, immolation of peoples, and vast material destruction. My delegation expresses the hope that given the concerted efforts of all the Arab states, they will be able to find a fair and swift solution to this conflict and thus shut the door in the face of the imperialists of today and yesterday who are seeking to dominate the Middle East and treat it as if it was its own backyard. So that's pretty straightforward. Basically the U.S. is treating Iraq as its own backyard. So just give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Just give me 1 second. Glad you could join us today. Okay, so I wanted to just before I proceed to continue, This is another book that I will be presenting. This has a good amount of stuff. The United States and UNESCO, 1945 to 1985 by Preston, Herman, and Schiller. It is basically the relationship of the U.S. and UNESCO, the U.S. media, the U.S. academia, and the U.S. government. And UNESCO, like we said, the U.S. government and the U.S. mass media is a state censorship media. It is not a free press. It is not a free flow of information. It is just a state censorship system. The government provides the lies and the media just presents the lies. It is just, the lies of the officials are translated into the unethical lies of the media. And this book, book, Hope and Folly is the name of it. It explains in detail every single lie that the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, Reader's Digest, Newsweek, all of them, that committed against UNESCO and that committed against free flow of information in the third world. The only goal of UNESCO was to promote the free flow of information in the third world, allowing for the nationalist ideas and the truthful ideas of the press in the third world. And the U.S. government and its mass media would not have it. It would not have UNESCO telling the truth. It would not allow UNESCO to tell the truth. It would flood the media with, information overload, just, millions of articles, just overload it and just fill it with lies, just, fill it up with state disinformation and state censorship. And there you go. You have a censorship system of all fascist articles. And that's what they were giving to the third world through their communications enterprise, the rich communication enterprise. And UNESCO said, get out of our face. The third world said, get out of our face, Yankee. You are a racist group of liar frauds. We don't want you in our organization. And U.S. left. The U.S. left. And now they're begging to be back. 2023, they rejoined as if this is like some sort of easy peasy. You just get out and you come back whenever it suits your purpose. They are Yankee fraud liars. They are Yankee butchers, Yankee fraud liars, Yankee propagandists, Yankee censorship system. The Yankee is a censorship press. The Yankee press, the American press, is a censorship press. It is a state disinformation press and a censorship press. So continuing on, Resolution 664, 1990. The Security Council, recalling the Iraqi invasion and the purported annexation of Kuwait in Resolution 660, 661, and 662, deeply concerned for the safety and well-being of third state nationals in Iraq and Kuwait, recalling the obligation of Iraq in this regard under international law, welcoming the efforts of the Secretary General to pursue urgent consultation with the government of Iraq following the concern and anxiety expressed by the members of the Council on August 17, 1990. Acting under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, demands that Iraq permit and facilitate the immediate departure from Kuwait and Iraq of the nationals of third countries and grant immediate and continuing access to consular officials to such nationals. Further demands that Iraq take no action to jeopardize the safety, security, and health of such nationals. Reaffirms its decision in Resolution 662 that an annexation of Kuwait by Iraq is null and void, and therefore demands that the government of Iraq rescind its orders for the closure of diplomatic and consular missions in Kuwait and the withdrawal of the immunity of their personnel and refrain from any such actions in the future. Request the Secretary General to report to the Council on compliance of this resolution in the earliest possible time. The Council should demand the U.S. end its illegal activities. Ricardo Alarcon, August 18, 1990. The Security Council has voted in favor of Resolution 664, 1990, bearing in mind the views expressed by some members of our Council and organization to the effect that the resolution is based exclusively on humanitarian considerations. Cuba voted in favor of it. My delegation naturally shares the concerns for the fate of any innocent civilians involved in the conflict. We believe that it is legitimate to express this concern in regard to certain nationals of other countries who are currently on Iraqi or Kuwaiti territory, but we believe also that there is a legitimate humanitarian concern. It should apply equally to the nationals of Iraq and Kuwait. In light of these conditions, we voted in favor of the draft resolution. We are concerned about the situation of innocent people involved in any conflict. We are concerned about the improper treatment of nationals of one or another country. We share this concern, which has been expressed by humanity on other occasions. It is not a new concern. Indeed, not long ago in this country, we were reminded of what had been done to persons of Japanese descent who were interned in concentration camps merely because of their national origin and because the United States was involved in a war with Japan. We remember that much more recently, severe limitations were placed on the ability of diplomats to leave Panama. What is more, tanks, heavy artillery, and major military concentrations were used to impede them from leaving their diplomatic missions and even moving from one embassy to another. Although the situation was particularly grievous with regard to the diplomats in my country, we cannot complain of discrimination since similar treatment was meted out to the Papal Nuncio and his colleagues in the Vatican mission in Panama and to representatives of other countries that had nothing to do with the conflict. Having voted for the resolution, we are duly bound, however, to draw attention to some of its aspects about which we have misgivings. First, I quote paragraph 1 of the operative section of the resolution. Demands that Iraq permit and facilitate the immediate departure from Kuwait and Iraq of the nationals of third world countries. In our informal consultation, references were made to the national origin of these individuals and figures were given. But we have not yet received an answer to the question we have asked for from the very outset. What is to happen to the large number of nationals of Palestine who are in the territory of Kuwait? Is the council asking that they be permitted to assist and assisted to return to their lands, which, as the council well knows, has been illegally occupied for so many years? Question mark. Does the council contemplate any action to ensure that the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians, which predate the conflict with which we are now dealing, are fulfilled? Perhaps we shall have to wait a while to get an answer to that question, from which a statistical point of view seems to be rather important according to the data with which we have been provided. The resolution welcomes the efforts of the Secretary General to pursue urgent consultations with the government of Iraq following concern and anxiety expressed by the Council yesterday. But it was rather hasty to call on us to adapt this resolution that we have just adopted when clearly the Secretary General has had very little time to engage in these diplomatic efforts that we all want him to engage in. In operative paragraph 2, the Council further demands that Iraq take no action to jeopardize the safety, security, or health of such nationals. We believe that neither Iraq nor anyone else should take any measure that will harm or jeopardize the security or health of these nationals or any other nationals in the area. It seems to us that this is a rather unilateral way of looking at the matter. Iraq is being asked to guarantee the health of foreign nationals on its territories, but we do not state in this resolution that the main factor that could place at risk the ability of the nationals of third countries or the nationals of Kuwait and Iraq to get sufficient food or medicine is that, with the full knowledge of the Security Council, one power, a permanent member of the Council, has arrogated itself to the power to decide what goes into or out of the territory of Kuwait and Iraq. The United States has not been authorized by anyone to have the arrival of food and medicine to Iraq. Resolution 661, of which the United States was a sponsor, clearly excludes medicine from the embargo or the sanctions and recognizes that there must be humanitarian considerations with regard to food. Nowhere in that resolution is it stated that it is for the U.S. government to determine when there are humanitarian circumstances and when there are not. Nonetheless, we have now been informed unilaterally that from now on, Washington will not take such requirements into account and such products will not enter into the area of question. Hence, if the Security Council wishes to be the least bit objective, it should be demand that the U.S. government put an immediate end to its illegal activities in the region. These activities, which have not been authorized by anyone, are adversely affecting the Security Council and health of the nationals of various countries, including those of Iraq and Kuwait. There have been other developments in recent days that, unfortunately, have not yet prompted the Security Council to take any action. Originally, we were convened to consider the imposition of sanctions against Iraq at a time when we all knew that such sanctions had already been applied by some developed countries. The Council adopted Resolution 661 and immediately, without any request from any quarter, without any authorization from anywhere, the U.S. government sent its Navy, its Air Force, and its soldiers to the region and began to ensure implementation of the resolution. That is not only a violation of the Charter, but a violation of Resolution 661 itself. And yet it is a resolution that the U.S. government is very much in favor of. Subsequently, a de facto naval blockade was put into place, and barely 48 hours, something rather strange happened. The members of the council received a communication dated August 16, 1990, and sent by Ambassador Alexander Watson, at that time acting as head of the U.S. mission. The communication informed us that the United States was applying blockade measures and alleged that it was doing so under Article 51 of the Charter and Security Council Resolution 661. I've already said that nowhere does that resolution authorize anyone to ask anyone, the United States or any other state, to implement the resolution by military means. Article 51 is undoubtedly known to any first grader in the United Nations system. It refers to a very old principle of humanity, the right to self-defense. And it could not be any clearer. It recognizes the right to self-defense, but also adds until the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. What we are witnessing now is a new and interesting phenomena, which would prompt the Council to take very clear decisions. The Charter is being amended. We are seeing a twisting of the terms of the original concept of the Charter with regard to self-defense. The Charter is being used deceitfully as something to be implemented unilaterally by one state after the Security Council has taken the decision it deems appropriate. Does that mean that the United States is not really in agreement with Resolution 661, which it promoted? Does it believe that the Security Council does not take the steps it should? Or contrary to Article 51, does it feel that it has the right to infringe upon the authority and responsibility of the Security Council? It has been alleged that on other occasions, the U.S. delegation has used a variety of arguments that the United States is implementing Resolution 661 on the basis of Article 41 of the Charter, but that article could not be clearer either. It refers to measures not involving the use of armed force. We believe that the Council will lose some of its credibility and moral authority if it refers only to some aspects of the complex and serious conflict with which we are dealing, and if it does so on the basis of a decision taken by one permanent member for that purpose, and to discuss which part of a given conflict in order to make a rapid decision on the matter. Up to now, the Security Council has been unable to act in another situation, one that is extremely clear because one of its members is using the resolution of the Security Council in the manner it describes most suitable to protect its own interests. I have before me the text of an important statement, a message from a distinguished Arab leader, President Ben Ali of the Republic of Tunisia, to help his people a few days ago. I shall read out part of the message as follows. The situation makes us wonder with bitterness about the basis for invoking international legality as a pretext for sending foreign troops to Arab soil. We ourselves have put much legality to the test through the now chronic Palestinian matter, the occupation of Arab territories, the invasion of Lebanon, and the repression of the Intifada, despite many resolutions adopted by the United Nations and the many votes on behalf of those who are clamoring for their legitimate rights. Events have demonstrated that legality and the principles that supposedly back it up are not adequate in the face of vital instruments of interest in the major powers, and this legality changes depending on the interest and relations with the party to be condemned. In expressing our agreement with the statement made by the president to the Republic of Tunisia, we should like once again to call the Council's attention to the need to take measures that will really make it possible to resolve the conflict peacefully. At the very least, we should make sure that the Council's resolutions or decisions are implemented in a manner in which the Council itself decides. My delegation voted in favor of the draft resolution out of humanitarian considerations, which we will consider to be legitimate. Some of our colleagues have explained their concerns with regard to their own nationals in the region. We also voted in favor of the draft resolution because we believe that it might, if the Council's authority is respected, help ensure this aspect is not used as one more excuse not to seek peace, but to continue along the course of war and military intervention. The representative of the United States concluded his statement by saying something that may be quite normal, but that at the same time could be a terrible threat. He said the United States was not only supporting the draft resolution, but would seek its full implementation. I am quoting exactly because the U.S. delegation did not circulate the text of the statement, earlier saying that it sought full implementation of sanctions. The United States sent in its Navy and deployed major military units, which continue to move into the area. Now, will the United States also implement this resolution by using force? Will it use the resolution to take unilateral measures? Or will U.S. action be kept strictly within the parameters of the resolution adopted unanimously? We shall wait and see. We cannot accept that a member of the council manipulate the council decisions. RICARDO, ALARCON, August 18, 1990. The following remarks were made in response to comments of Thomas Pickering, U.S. Permanent United Nations member representative. Far be it from me at this stage to embark upon a legal discussion, but we still have the same concern. That is whether Article 51 can be construed to allow, on the decision of any member state, actions that have not been agreed upon by the Security Council, including the use of armed force, and whether Resolution 661 can be constituted to allow the United States to use military means for the purpose no one has authorized. I think we are right to express our profound concern that the United States will also try to promote the full implementation of the resolution we have adopted and taking aggressive military action, including the use of warships and bombers. I think that what is most important about the article and resolution from which he has quoted is that both assert this council's authority to handle the crisis. We have a delegation that comes before us, as it frequently does, and calls upon us to take a decision so that the council may act. Then it goes on to say it is acting as it must, irrespective of the decisions of the council. Either one follows decisions of the council or one does not, but we cannot accept that a member of the council manipulates the council's decisions according to its own interests. The only special privilege of permanent security members is the one unfortunately set forth in the charter, the right to veto. But please, I think it would be a most serious matter for all members of the organization if we were to tolerate their using the charter and the decisions of the council to do as they please. A grave violation of UN Charter legitimizing illegal actions by the U.S. Navy in the Gulf. Resolution 665, 1990. Security Council, 13-0-2. Recalling this resolution 660, 661, 662, and 664, and demanding their full immediate implementation. Having decided that Resolution 661 to impose economic sanctions under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations, determined to bring to end the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, which imperils the existence of a member state, and to restore the legitimate authority, the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Kuwait, which requires the speedy implementation of the above resolutions. Deploring the loss of innocent life stemming from the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and determined to prevent further losses. Gravely alarmed that Iraq continues to refuse to comply with Resolution 660, 61, 662, and 664, and in particular the conduct of the government of Iraq in using Iraqi flag vessels to export oil. Calls upon those member states cooperating with the government of Kuwait, which are deploying maritime forces to the area, to use such measures commensurate to their specific circumstances as may be necessary under the authority of the Security Council to halt all inward and outward maritime shipping in order to inspect and verify their cargoes and destination, to ensure strict implementation on the provisions related to the shipping laid down in Resolution 661. Invites member states accordingly to cooperate as may be necessary to ensure compliance with the provisions of Resolution 661, with maximum use of political and diplomatic measures in accordance with paragraph 1 above. Requests all states to provide in accordance with the Charter such assistance as may be required by the states referred to in paragraph 1 of this resolution. Further requests the states concerned to coordinate their actions in pursuit of the above paragraphs of this resolution, using as appropriate mechanisms of the Military Staff Committee, and after consultation with the Secretary General, to submit reports to the Security Council and its committee established under Resolution 661 to facilitate the monitoring and the implementation of this resolution. Decides to remain actively seized of the matter. Blessings for the U.S. force already unilaterally deployed. The following remarks were made during discussion of the Security Council Resolution 665, 1990. RICARDO, ALARCON, August 25, 1990. My delegation voted in favor of Resolution 660, thus expressing the support for the sovereignty, national independence, and territorial integrity of Kuwait, and calling for the immediate withdrawal of the Iraqi troops that are occupying the territory of that state. It also voted in favor of Resolution 662, and in that way rejected the claim of annexation of Kuwait. In addition, it voted in favor of Resolution 664, thereby expressing its rejection of the situation that had been created with regard to foreigners in Kuwait and Iraq and the existing situation concerning diplomatic missions in Kuwait. Although we abstained from voting on Resolution 661, my government has taken the relevant steps to ensure that our country too complies with it. We are now being presented with a new draft resolution that raises a number of questions and compels us to raise various objections to it. While we recognize, as our colleague from Yemen has just done, the efforts which the original author of the draft resolution has been prevailed upon to make, and which have ensured that at least some formulations have become less ambiguous and less contrary to the Charter, I must state that the text in present form remains unacceptable. First of all, it is clear that the Council is now being called upon to take cognizance of something that has been going on for a few days. The Security Council has not yet determined that there is a need to use military force to the implementation of a security to any of its resolutions, but the forces are already deployed. The Security Council has not yet determined that the measures it previously decided upon have proved inadequate. The Council has not even been able to, nor will be able to apparently, wait until the Secretary General submits the first report on the implementation of Resolution 661, which by agreement between the members of the Council should be issued about September 6th. Apart from the haste to move on the use of force, to permit the force already unilaterally deployed in the area to continue doing what it has been doing. Now, with the blessing of the Security Council, the Council is now to confirm that there exists in the zone a de facto situation that was not authorized by it, that was not decided upon by it, and has nothing to do with the use of force in accordance with the charter of the organization. In addition to the fact that the Security Council has not taken the stand it should have taken and called for putting an end to that situation, which threatens to abrogate and further the grave conflict we have been dealing with for some time, we are now being asked to endorse or validate an action that cannot be justified under law. Perhaps that is why it has been necessary to resort to a strange and tortuous wording that has nothing to do with the concepts laid down in our charter, and that specifically in my delegation's view represents a clear violation of Article 41, Article 42, Article 43, Paragraph 1, Article 46, 47, Paragraph 1, and Article 48, Paragraph 1. There will be very few paragraphs in Chapter 7 left inviolate if the Council adopts the draft resolution now before it. Reference is made to using forces, but it is not known who the members of those forces are. We know that if we read the newspapers, but no one can know from reading of the draft resolution the Council is about to adopt. We do not know when the Council determined that certain countries would form part of those forces, nor do we know who commands them, although all of us more or less suspect it is a ranking officer of the U.S. forces identified every day as the chief of operations in that region. But that commander has not been appointed to this council, and if Chapter 7 of the UN Charter still remains in fact, it is the job of the Council to designate the officer to command the forces it decides to employ. According to operative Paragraph 1, these forces will be operating in the area, but their purpose will be to halt all inward and outward shipping. It does not say where or from where. I assume it means the region, but it is so ill-defined that the zone could extend all around the planet. Nor does it indicate against whom these forces would operate, although it is implied that the purpose would be to halt all, I emphasize all, the maritime shipping, either inward or outward. The text fails to stipulate to whom such forces would be responsible. It is clear they would be responsible for the immediate military commanders, but the Council is now taking on an ambiguous responsibility because the same operative paragraph states, although I don't know why, under the authority of the Security Council. If the Security Council is really acting responsibly and seriously, and those who are observing its work must assume at the very least that it is when it talks of using military force, then the Council should have drawn on those articles of Chapter 7 that clearly spell out how this responsibility, this authority should be exercised. For example, Article 46, which we presume is still valid because we are not aware that the Charter has been revised in these early hours of the morning states. Plans for the application of armed force shall be made by the Security Council with the assistance of the Military Staff Committee. It appears that tonight will mark the birth of the Military Staff Committee because there is reference to it. For what I believe, it is the first time an operative Paragraph 4 of a draft that will be probably approved. As far as I know, it has not been meeting a draft to any plan, and I do not believe the Council has convened it either formally or informally to draw up any plan for the deployment of any forces in any part of the world. The subsequent Article 47, in speaking the functions of that committee, says, among other things, that it should assist the Security Council in the employment and command of forces placed at its disposal. Article 43, which I suspect is also valid, says that all members of the United Nations, in order to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, undertake to make available to the Security Council on its call. The rest of the paragraph, which is quite long, spells out the special measures that must be undertaken to place at the disposal of the Security Council the armed forces it requests. Therefore, one can imagine the steps the Security Council should have to take should it determine that measures already taken under Article 41, which as yet includes the use of force, were inadequate. It will first act in conformity with the Article 42, but without overlooking the articles that follow, and make a determination as to whether the measures on whose implementation the Secretary General would be reporting on 2 weeks have been insufficient. After having done that, it would have to then consider whether additional measures were necessary, possibly including the use of military forces. The Council would then request certain states to make some of those forces available to the Security Council. The Council would make the plans for the deployment and operations of those forces and would assume command of them. However carefully and however often one reads the draft resolution that will soon be submitted for a vote, it is impossible to find any of these criteria in any of its paragraphs. In adopting this draft resolution, as I imagine the Council will do, the Council will, in fact, through its own resolution, allow the continuation of an illegitimate situation. That situation will then assume a kind of legitimacy because of the adoption of this draft resolution, which I imagine will become Resolution 665. We would all be deceiving ourselves if we thought that by our giving a number of set of unilateral actions and provisions, they will cease being violations of the Charter and of the fundamental principles of the United Nations. We would be deceiving ourselves if we thought by adding the UN insignia to some of the vessels of the zone, we would then be acting in accordance with Chapter 7 of the Charter. But in addition, and this is the most regrettable thing, we would perhaps be adding fuel and further reason for alarm to an already grave situation that is already a cause for great alarm and concerns throughout the international community. That is, it is a matter of further alarm for the world to see this council acting in a manner that departs from its fundamental functions. There are some other questions that are even more difficult to answer or even to imagine to answer to. The draft resolution refers to forces that have been deployed specifically to maritime forces. Everyone is aware that there are also numerous forces on the ground and the air operating according to a plan that is unknown to any of us around this table, except perhaps for our colleague from the United States. They are operating under a command structure that is also unknown to anyone except perhaps him. So there are naval, air, and land forces in the area, and they may be carrying out tasks in accordance with what the resolution calls for, or they may add the conflict in the region. We can now anticipate that the Security Council will be required to take responsibility for any other action or warlike move that may arise from the decision of the commander of our forces, someone who up to now we either know or have designated. Is that really a way the Security Council should act on questions of such importance as the use of armed force to supposedly guarantee the implementation of decisions of this body? We have had many long hours of discussion and negotiation, but we are truly very far from being convinced that this is the appropriate approach to be taken by this body or by the United Nations. I should like to add in conclusion that my delegation continues to believe that no action or decision be adopted by this council can it give it political, legal, or moral authority to undertake any kind of action of an inherently inhuman character. In this respect, we refer to any action designed to deprive millions of innocent civilians, including children, women, and elderly people, of food, medicine, or medical assistance. My delegation firmly maintains that this interpretation of international mortality, of international legality, and no devious argument or attempt at justification can sway us from this conviction. My delegation will not, of course, for the reasons I have stated, vote in favor of this draft resolution. Cuba refuses to legitimize the piratical actions of the U.S. Navy. Editorial in Granma, August 27, 1990. The following editorial was published on August 27, 1990, and in the issue of Granma, the daily newspaper of the Communist Party of Cuba. After a week of negotiations, the United States succeeded on Saturday, August 25th, in having the Security Council adopt Resolution 665, a resolution that for the first time in the history of the United Nations authorizes the use of force to ensure compliance with an embargo. In this case, an embargo declared against Iraq. Co-sponsors of the resolution included the United States, the UK, and France. 13 countries that are members of the Council voted for it, including the 5 permanent members: China, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Cuba, Yemen abstained. The initial version of the resolution was first circulated Monday, August 20th, in the course of negotiations that this U.S. representative conducted with other members of the Security Council. The draft resolution underwent a number of modifications and that softened its language but did not alter its essence. Retained in particular were sections that constitute a grave violation and unacceptable reinterpretation of the United Nations Charter in giving legitimacy to the unilateral and illegal actions carried out by the U.S. Navy in the Gulf. This opens the door to further actions that may bring about armed conflict with dangerous and unforeseeable consequences. In assessing this issue, it is important to note that the Security Council resolution of August 6th establishing the embargo against Iraq is based on Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, in particular Article 41 of Chapter 7, which deals with the measures, sanctions that do not involve the use of force. Resolution 661 also established a committee chaired by Finland to verify compliance with the resolution and asked the Secretary General of the United Nations to provide the Security Council with a report on this aspect within 30 days. Up to now, however, neither the committee nor the Secretary General have presented a report indicating these measures are inadequate or that the embargo is not being complied with. The document approved Saturday, August 25th by the Security Council establishes, without stating it, a de facto naval blockade of Iraq. But such a measure can be adopted only on the basis of Article 42 of the Charter, which authorizes the use of force. The fact that the Council's decision is not based on Article 42 not only undermines the validity, but is a violation of the Charter itself. What is the violation? It stems from the fact that a decision has been made to apply measures that involve the use of force, and that this has been done without first establishing that the steps taken so far within the context of Resolution 661 are inadequate and have been proven to be so. The action was taken not by invoking Article 42 in the Charter as it legally required, but by acting as if the new measures did not go beyond Article 41, which applies only to actions that do not involve the use of force. The violation is a deceitful and unlawful interpretation of the UN Charter. It introduces grave provisions with dangerous consequences under the cover of decisions whose scope stops precisely short of the use of force. Also of concern is the fact that the Council has decided to leave in the hands of a group of unidentified states. The resolution vaguely refers to those member states cooperating with the government of Kuwait, which are deploying maritime forces to the area, the authority to use such measures, commensurate by the specific circumstances as may be necessary, under the authority of the Security Council to halt inward and outward maritime shipping. It is truly astounding that a body that has never before in the 45-year history of the United Nations authorized the use of force should do so now in such an irresponsible manner. It has not even identified the governments that will implement it, the extent of their powers to do so, or who will decide on the degree of force commensurate of the specific circumstances as may be necessary. This is the context to which Cuba refused, despite Iraq's unacceptable conduct in invading and occupying Kuwait, and in refusing to comply with the Security Council resolution cited, to endorse such a violation and reinterpretation of the UN Charter, and to legitimize by the vote of its practical actions the U.S. Navy has been carrying out in the Arab-Persian Gulf. Cuba also believes that the United Nations Secretary General, the Security Council, the leaders of the Arab League, and of the non-aligned movement can take actions that will help obtain a political settlement and provide conflict of greater propositions, thus meeting the goals of the United Nations. Resolution 665, adopted last Saturday, establishes a virtual naval blockade against Iraq that is without justification in the current situation. It gives U.S. naval officers the power to decide whether or not to use force and to what extent to do so. This is not only legally objectionable, but also represents a military escalation that can only increase in tension. It makes it more difficult to attain a political settlement, which is what we would like to see and how the international community should be working towards. So, of course, you can see, we just want to make some comments. The standard stuff, the media, the U.S. media, the mass media, the Western media, it's frauds, it's state censorship, it's state disinformation, it's deceit. The word deceit is all over the press, the U.S. press, the mass media. It's deceit, it's state disinformation, it's state censorship. The U.S. press is state censorship system. It is a group of liars, frauds, propagandists, falsifiers, omitters, and fabricators. They are, ethical fabricators is what we said. So access to basic foodstuffs and to adequate medical assistance is a fundamental human right. Resolution supported by Cuba. The following resolution rejected by the Security Council by a vote of 5-3, Britain, Canada, Finland, France, the U.S. against, China, Cuba, and Yemen 4. reaffirming the faith and fundamental human rights in the dignity and worth of human persons and in the equal rights of men and women and of the nations and small and large, recalling Resolution 660, 661, 662, 664, and 665. Recalling further paragraph C of paragraph 3 and paragraph 4 of Resolution 661, and deeply concerned about the safety and well-being of the civilian population of the foreign residents in Iraq and Kuwait. That declares that the access to basic foodstuffs and to adequate medical assistance is a fundamental human right to be protected under all circumstances. Decides that in accordance with the above principle, under no circumstances shall action be taken, including those resulting from the implementation of Security Council decisions, such as Resolution 661 and 665, that may hinder the access of the civilian population and the foreign nationals in Iraq and Kuwait to basic foodstuffs, medical supplies, and medical assistance. Requests the Secretary General to keep the Council permanently informed about the implementation of this resolution. Resolution 666, Security Council, September 13, 1990. Recalling the Resolution 661, paragraph 3 and 4, of which apply except in humanitarian circumstances to foodstuffs. Recognizing the circumstances may arise in which it will be necessary for foodstuffs to be supplied to the civilian population in Iraq or Kuwait in order to relieve human suffering. Noting that in this respect, the committee established under paragraph 6 of that resolution has received communication from several member states. Emphasizing that it is for the Security Council alone to act through the committee to determine whether humanitarian circumstances have arisen. Deeply concerned that Iraq has failed to comply with its obligation under Security Council Resolution 664 in respect to the safety and well-being of third state nationals, and reaffirming that Iraq retains full responsibility in this regard under international humanitarian law, including where applicable, the Fourth Geneva Convention, action under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations, decides that in order to make the necessary determination whether or not for the purpose of paragraph 3 and paragraph 4 of Resolution 661, humanitarian circumstances have arisen, the committee shall keep in the situation regarding foodstuffs in Iraq and Kuwait under constant review. Decides that in order to make the necessary determination whether or not for the purposes of paragraph 3 and paragraph 4 of Resolution 661, humanitarian circumstances have arisen, the committee shall keep the situation regarding foodstuffs in Iraq and Kuwait under constant review. It expects Iraq to comply with the obligations under Security Council Resolution 664 in respect of third state nationals, and reaffirms the Iraq remains fully responsible for their safety and well-being in accordance with international humanitarian law, including, where applicable, the Fourth Geneva Convention. The request for the purpose of paragraph 1 and 2 of this resolution and the Secretary General seek urgently and on a continuing basis information from relevant United Nations and other appropriate humanitarian agencies and all other sources on the availability of food in Iraq and Kuwait, such information to be communicated by the Secretary General to the committee regularly. The request further that seeking and supplying such information, particular attention will be paid to such categories of persons that might suffer, especially such as children under 15 years of age, expectant mothers, maternity cases, the sick, and the elderly. Decides that if the committee, after receiving the reports from the Secretary General, determines that circumstances have arisen in which there is an urgent humanitarian need to supply foodstuffs to Iraq or Kuwait in order to relieve human suffering, it will report promptly to the Council its decision as to how such needs should be met. Directs the committee that in formulating its decision, it should bear in mind that foodstuffs should be provided through the United Nations in cooperation of the International Committee of the Red Cross or other appropriate humanitarian agencies, and distributed by them under their supervision in order to ensure that they reach the intended beneficiaries. The request the Secretary General to use his good offices to facilitate the delivery and distribution of foodstuffs to Kuwait and to Iraq in accordance with the provisions of this and all other relevant resolutions. Recalls that Resolution 661 does not apply to supplies intended strictly for medical purposes, but in this connection recommends that medical supplies should be exported under the strict supervision of the government of the exporting state and by appropriate humanitarian agencies. Inhuman measures whose sole and exclusive victims will be innocent civilians. RICARDO ALARCON, September 13, 1990. I wish to first congratulate you, Mr. President, on your assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for the month of September. I also want to congratulate the permanent representative of Romania on the way in which he conducted the complicated work that faced the Council last month. We also wish to welcome the new representative of the United Kingdom as he takes up his work in the Security Council. Mr. President, my delegation is pleased to see you presiding over the Security Council, not only because of your professional qualities as a diplomat, which will certainly contribute to our work, but also because you represent a country, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, that is united to mine by deep-seated ties of brotherhood and friendship. The Cuban people will be forever grateful to the Soviet people, to their government, and to their party for the cooperation they extended to us at the very beginning when my country had to confront a ferocious and tenacious economic, trade, and financial blockade. That blockade has been in force for almost 30 years now. Of course, it includes total denial of any possibility of access to the markets for food, medicine, or medical supplies in the country that is illegally imposing that blockade. Thus, we are very familiar with the subject now before the Security Council. That is why we have various reasons for not being in agreement with the draft resolution submitted to the Council. Cuba regards as completely inadmissible the very idea of utilizing hunger by depriving peoples of what is an absolutely fundamental right of every single human being in every part of the world and in any circumstances. That is the right to receive an adequate food and appropriate medical care. We do not believe that anyone has the political, judicial, or moral authority to apply inhuman measures such as those whose sole and exclusive victims would be innocent civilians. And that is what we are concerned with here. Moreover, we must recall that this draft resolution has been put before us in the concrete context. It has its own history. The Security Council was able to act expeditiously and with singular energy when it adopted sanctions against Iraq and Kuwait that were more comprehensive than any ever envisaged before. It acted equally hastily in adopting a resolution whose legality is at the very least open to question, or to be more accurate, a resolution that entirely violates the United Nations Charter. I refer to Resolution 665, which permits the continued exercise and deployment of military force in the Gulf region in an effort to impose, by force if necessary, the total sanctions that have been imposed against Iraq and Kuwait. Resolution 661, on the other hand, at least contained reference to the possibility of providing food under humanitarian circumstances, practically since the day it was adopted, or to be more specific, since the establishment of the Sanctions Committee. We have spent countless hours trying to define the criteria the Council should follow in interpreting these clauses of the Resolution 661. While that was occurring, the Council received information from the various sources as to the consequences for thousands and thousands of innocent individuals. Affected first and foremost were the citizens of Kuwait, a country that has fallen victim to a resolution we have condemned and rejected. We continue to call for immediate solution to that situation. The Security Council has also punished, even more so now, with the new measures, the people of Iraq and the nationals of many other states present on Iraqi and Kuwaiti territory. Every day, in increasingly alarming terms, there are reports on the situation confronting the population there. Even had we not been informed of this by the mass media, the Council has received more than one formal and official request for adoption of urgent measures to keep people from dying for lack of food. We have read the letters from the ambassadors of India, Sri Lanka, and Philippines, and other countries. They have called upon this body, which was not compelled to adopt Resolution 661, to take humanitarian measures to deal with the situation in which these innocent persons find themselves. Not only has the Security Council not responded to those appeals, it is now invited to adopt a resolution that would basically make even more difficult and distant the possibility of even hoping that any real substance can be given to our supposedly humanitarian premises. The draft resolution to be submitted to us does not explain what will happen if the 100,000 Sri Lankans who have been trapped on Kuwaiti territory, and no one has even suggested how they can receive food. The Security Council will now establish machinery that is neither swift nor compelling. It is not motivated by the anxiety or haste that caused us to spend so many nights in this chamber in August, but rather an exemplary patience and singular tranquility at a time when we are dealing with human suffering. First of all, we would entrust the Secretary General with the urgent task of gathering information on the situation regarding the availability of food in Kuwait. And the Secretary General, as we all know, has reported to members of the Council on the difficulties the organization is having in the field. He has reported that the organization basically has no representatives there in a position to shoulder responsibilities, particularly those that would flow from this resolution. On the basis of such information, the committee could proceed to analyze the data with a view to determining whether or not such circumstances indicating it is of utmost urgency that Iraq or Kuwait be given humanitarian aid. The result will be the production of a report, not food, and I expect the report that would then come to the Council. But nowhere in the resolution is there even suggestion as to what the Council would do to find ways and means of ensuring help for the nationals of third world countries. And please let us not forget those of Kuwait, to whom no specific reference appears in the resolution we are invited to adopt. Although was clearly covered in the resolution the Council preferred to reject a few minutes ago. nor, I repeat, is there mention of Iraqi citizens. We might envisage that beginning now, the Council would resume the spirit of those moments in August and begin taking up with pressure, urgency, these very serious problems now confronting so many innocent people. Frankly, I see no special reason for feeling enthusiastic about that possibility, because this very Council has also received a series of urgent requests under Article 50 of the Charter asking us to adopt decisions that would help alleviate the serious problems confronting countries other than those we have mentioned. To date, the list includes 10 member states of our organization, with Jordan at the top of the list. The moment is drawing near in which we may be compelled to act at a pace even greater than the speed with which we acted in August. Soon a month will have passed since the permanent representative of Jordan, in a well-documented communication, told the Council about the very serious economic and social consequences the sanctions have established this time. The Council was even able to do the sanctions as established in resolutions would have on his country. If after all this time, the Council was even able to do so much as adopt a resolution regarding Jordan, and it is not yet clear to my delegation that this is the case, we would finally be showing some kind of concern about the case we all acknowledge to be the most urgent and grave of all, and one that most of all to be dealt with especially speedily. I am not in a position to say much that is encouraging to the 9 other colleagues on the list, whose cases we have not even had a chance to consider. I believe this Council has a great moral responsibility. On the one hand, it is right that we should all try to ensure full implementation of the basic resolutions we have adopted. Above all, in our opinion, Resolution 660, which calls for an end to the conflict in the region. It is also correct for us to monitor, through the Sanctions Committee, complete implementation of these measures as they were stipulated in the text of the resolution adopted here. But on the other hand, I also think the Council should act as a body that demonstrates maturity and a sense of responsibility. The history of this organization is perfectly well known. The hour is too late for me to take the Council through the lengthy list of countries that were represented here when the Council of the General Assembly discussed the question of economic sanctions in the past. And any case we might choose to at random would clearly demonstrate that before the adoption of any decision, there was painstaking care taken into consideration the economic consequences of that decision might entail. In certain cases, such as that of South Africa, there is an inexhaustible store of quotations from some permanent members of the Council, even very recent quotations. There is no need to go back into history in which they argue that the economic sanctions should not be imposed against South Africa because these would also harm the country's black majority. I know that our colleagues from the United States and the United Kingdom are very familiar with that position because it is one they consistently maintain for many years. They continue to maintain it to some extent. Then there is the case of economic sanctions that were imposed against Southern Rhodesia. At the time, the United States, which is not a third world country or a poor country, but a wealthy, developed country, felt it had to violate them by continuing to import chromium from Southern Rhodesia. It's stated as much right here in the Security Council, in this very chamber, and the Council, as far as I know, sent no fleets, adopted no resolution of condemnation, and took no special measures of any sort. It seemed to consider it natural that the representative of the United States should say something I'm going to quote. It will be one of the few quotes I cite. The United States representative explained that the decision to resume imports from Southern Rhodesian chromium has been prompted by genuine consideration of the United States national security and by its requirements of materials of strategic importance which could not be obtained cheaper anywhere else. Can you imagine, fellow representatives, that any state in the world were today to apply the same logic to oil, for which we have to now pay at least double the price we are paying before this crisis? Isn't oil a strategic material for everyone? Hasn't this been explained clearly by 10 representatives who have communicated with the Council under Article 50 of the Charter? But in the document I quoted from, which is not something from ancient history, it seemed to be natural for a great power to tell the Security Council that it had decided to continue to buy chromium despite the ban because it could not find it cheaper anywhere. Another quotation. He pointed out the United States imports of strategic materials from Southern Rhodesia amounted to only 2% of the territory's total exports of these commodities. It was in 1972 that the then permanent representative of the United States, George Bush, told that to the Security Council. The Council adopted no special measures, and the import of chromium continued. The following year, the representative of the United States again explained his country's position. The quotation is even shorter. The United States representative objected to the fact that many speakers had singled out his government for blame as a violator of sanctions. He emphasized that although the United States had authorized the importation of chromium from southern Rhodesia, such imports constitute only 5% of that territory's annual exports. One year it had been 2%, the following year it was 5%. Still, it was a figure that was more or less acceptable to council, and the imports continued for as long as the U.S. government felt them advisable. There are also many references I should cite on how arms embargo against South Africa was handled. Shortly after the embargo was adopted by the Security Council, the representative of the same country explained why the United States continued to send arms to South Africa, and the explanation was apparently the same, satisfactory at the time. Current deliveries of arms to South Africa, he said, consisted entirely of spare parts supplied under contract made before December 31st, 1963, the effective date of the United Nations embargo. Can you imagine what would take place in a sanctions committee if any country on earth dared to say it was delivering exports to Iraq or Kuwait because the contracts were made before the date sanctions were adopted? I think the first to leap up and call this clear violation of the sanctions would be the very country that was able to be so flexible when commercial advantages and contract it felt must be respected were at stake. I want to say if this council were in the future to deem it necessary to impose sanctions with the same strictness and firmness that marked this case, for which there is no comparison in the organization's history, the council should never have taken such action before. It should at least be obliged to foresee the consequences its decision might entail. For other states that are not supposed to be the object of the sanctions, and it should be obliged to foresee the implication for millions of individuals who, simply because they live in the area of the conflict, could suffer grave consequences. If such foresight were impossible because the sanctioned resolution were to be adopted within a few hours, the world might at least expect that in the course of the following month we would be able to adopt a consistent position on the problems arising from the implementation of our decisions. My delegation considers that exactly the opposite has occurred. The council has been compelled, for reasons that we all know, which I need not repeat here, to follow one course of action and one alone. But something has occurred in the course of the past week that my delegation frankly finds irritating. I am revealing no secret here. I think that all of us in the building know what happened in the Sanctions Committee. We all know about the lengthy consultations that were held on the communications that had been received from the ambassadors of India and the Philippines on the one hand, and Sri Lanka on the other, about the efforts that should be made to take rapid steps, at least with regard to the specific requests we have received. As we all know how that began with a seemingly very simple discussion about whether or not we would authorize an Indian vessel to deliver food that was urgently required by the Indian population in the region, ended up, by some strange twist of fate, with the resolution we have before us now. That occurred despite the fact that the council and its committee had precedents, not from ancient history, but from recent past, as to how such questions should be settled when they were raised, not by the third world countries, but by other states. Everyone knows that when an authorization was requested to fly aircraft of some members of the council to pick up nationals of their countries who wish to return to their country of origin, or to fly Iraqi airplanes to do the same, there were no long negotiations, lengthy discussions, or complicated texts. The Sanctions Committee quickly and simply expressed agreements to such operations. We did it at once, and since it has recurred without the committee having to discuss it again. My delegation entirely agrees that the interpretation of the request that it was received at the time from the United Kingdom. If I am not mistaken, I expect that in carrying out such activities, there had been communication with the Iraqi authorities, and there had been some financial payments. It is normal to pay for the overflight, the airport services, and so forth. But when India comes and tells us that tens of thousands of its nationals are in a distressing situation in which they lack food, and they tell us that they have a vessel that stands ready and loaded with food to send to Kuwait, we then become involved in the most complicated negotiations, simply to authorize India to send one vessel to Kuwait one time to deliver food to those individuals. It would involve no financial transaction benefiting Iraq, but it must help save some innocent persons who have the right to live and who, by the way, have nothing to do with the parties in the conflict. I wonder whether it is really fair for us to be so painstaking with regard to the drama of people of the developed countries, the countries of the North, while we remain impassive before the clamor of the hundreds of thousands of individuals whose names appear nowhere in the leg of big newspapers, whose stories have not been told, but who, in the view of our delegation, have precisely the same rights as those from the wealthier countries, those with lighter skins, or those who bear passports that are obviously more useful. At the very least, my delegation cannot accept having the Security Council act in such a differential and discriminatory fashion with regard to the various parties. We might have thought that 1 month later the Security Council would at least be in a position to deal with these problems and be responding to one or more of the cases of which we were notified. But instead, we find something much worse. A draft resolution has been put before us that would, in fact, extend and reinforce the sanctions against Kuwait and Iraq to include food. That means our taking a tortuous path, one that, in fact, may be a dead end with regard to imperative and urgent needs and requests received from various member states, needs that we ourselves know to exist. It has been said on a previous occasion, as it may be now, that it is justifiable to take such drastic measures and be so cold in the face of human suffering in order to ensure that these measures are implemented and the goal obtained, independently of whatever effectiveness we may have demonstrated in the past. But East Jerusalem has been occupied and annexed by an occupying power. Though Golan Heights was and continues to be annexed by an occupying power. This is not ancient history, but it is a current fact. But there is no talk about that. There is no talk about sanctions. There is no talk about measures of force, the occupier of those two territories, those whose names is perfectly familiar for the members of the council, to abide by the decisions of this same body. I have quoted some material about South Africa. This is more ancient history, not ancient history either. At the very moment, the General Assembly is considering a report from the Secretary General on the implementation of the declaration adopted by consensus only a few months ago. At this very moment, this is not ancient history. Tomorrow, the debate will continue here in this building, as the Secretary General knows full well. His report contains information and replies from member states that certainly do not indicate they are complying with or will continue to comply with sanctions against South Africa. Rather, what the General Assembly is facing today, and our African brothers and sisters know this full well, is a dangerous tendency to water down the policy of sanctions against South Africa, to try to undermine the position of the international community against apartheid, and to seek measures of accommodation with Pretoria regime before the General Assembly and Security Council resolutions are complied with. But it was also this very council that established the committee to monitor the implementation of the sanctions adopted in Resolution 418, and everyone knows that the committee has been sleeping the sleep of the righteous for approximately 2 months. Why? Because we had to concentrate on the real sanctions there was to apply, sanctions that, come what may, will cost the lives that they will cost. We cannot accept this approach. And this is not ancient history. We believe that we are to have a minimum of consistency. If we are to believe that we have a minimum of consistency, we must consider the possibility of rescuing from almost certain death that other sanctions committee and that other set of partial sanctions affecting weapons alone, that this council decide on the case of South Africa. My delegation firmly believed that the conflict that has arisen through the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq must be settled by means of the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi troops from Kuwait. We firmly believe that the full sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Kuwait must be restored immediately. We believe that the nationals of third countries in Iraq or Kuwait have no rights that no one should abrogate, limit, or infringe upon, such as the rights to leave and return to that country and the right of adequate food, and to all conditions inherent in maintaining their human dignity. But we also believe that these same rights are possessed by the people of Kuwait, the civilian population of Iraq, and the nationals of third countries in the region, despite the fact that those third countries have the ill fortune of belonging to the third world rather than the world of riches. We are now not prepared to support any action that will continue to ignore the tragedy for which those who originally caused this conflict are responsible. But the Security Council is also responsible because of the measures it adopted, and because in doing so, it does not take into consideration the problems it was creating for innocent people. That is why we put forward a draft resolution that we believe would receive the Council's approval. If you read it, you will see that on the basis of quotations from the Charter of our organizing, it focuses on principles that, while it did not receive the necessary vote, nonetheless continues to be a principle that no one has the right to flout. The principle that access to basic foodstuffs and to adequate medical assistance is a fundamental right to be protected under all circumstances. Since it will henceforth be increasingly difficult for millions of innocent individuals to express that right, and since far from instigating the suffering of individuals, as is claimed in the draft resolution we are discussing, the Council's decision would instead perhaps increase it. My delegation is unable to vote in favor of the draft resolution that has been submitted. So that's a good article. That's a good section, Ricardo Alarcon. Just a couple comments. And so the standard thing, racist U.S. government, they're racist Yankee butchers, their, South African Rhodesian, affinity, their love for Southern racist Rhodesia, they, continue to import chromium, right? And it was so important for finances, for the U.S. government, for the Yankee butchers to import chromium from Rhodesia. So they continue to import chromium. And, lo and behold, you get to the Iraq war, and then we have to sanction, Iraq's oil. And so nobody can buy oil from Iraq. And when people say that, well, it's a strategic interest, then the United States says, no, you can't have oil from Iraq because we make the rules. Yeah, but your chromium is okay, even though there was a ban by the Security Council on purchasing chromium. Because the U.S. government are racist, butchers, Yankee racist, butchers of Hispanics, blacks, and Asians. And that is why, they do whatever they want, whenever they want. That was basically the summary. And then we talked about the U.S. mass media. Again, it's a state disinformation system. It's a state censorship system. It's a totalitarian press, a fascist press. There's no democracy. It's just a fascist, selective reporting. Falsifications omit the important viewpoints, the third, fourth, second, third, fourth, and fifth viewpoints, and you just present the government handout viewpoint, the government state censorship viewpoint, and the disinformation of all the other information or all the other viewpoints are just completely, piled up in disinformation, lies, and propaganda. So continuing on, no reference is made to the need to find a peaceful solution to the conflict. Resolution 661. So we're going to just, do the resolution, and then we're going to, there's two sections. So this is Security Council, September 18, 1990. Reaffirming the resolution 660 through 666, recalling the Vienna Convention of April 18, 1961 on diplomatic relations, and of April 24, 1963 on consular relations, to both of which Iraq is a party. Considering that the decision of Iraq to order the closure of diplomatic and consular missions in Kuwait and to withdraw the immunity and privileges of these missions and their personnel is contrary to the declaration of the Security Council at the international conventions mentioned above and international law. Deeply concerned that Iraq, notwithstanding the decisions of the Security Council and the provisions of the convention mentioned above, has committed acts of violence against the diplomatic missions and their personnel in Kuwait. Outrage at the recent violations of Iraq by diplomatic premises in Kuwait and the abduction of personnel enjoying some diplomatic immunity and foreign nationals who were present in these premises. Considering that the above actions by Iraq constitute aggressive acts and a flagrant violation of its international obligations, would strike at the root of the conduct of the international relations in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Recalling that Iraq is fully responsible for any use of violence against foreign nationals or against any diplomatic or consular mission in Kuwait or its personnel. Determined to ensure the respect for its decisions by Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations. Further considering that the grave nature of Iraq's actions would constitute a new escalation of its violation of international law, obliges the Council not to express its immediate action, but to consult urgency to take further concrete measures to ensure Iraq's compliance with the Council's resolutions. Acting under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations, strongly condemns the aggressive acts perpetrated by Iraq against the diplomatic premises and the personnel in Kuwait, including the abduction of foreign nationals who were present on those premises. Demands that the immediate release of those foreign nationals, as well as other nationals mentioned in Resolution 664. Further demands that Iraq immediately and fully comply with international obligations under Resolutions 662 and 664 of the Security Council, the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic and Consular Relations, and international law. Further demands that Iraq immediately protect the safety and well-being of diplomatic and consular personnel and premises on Kuwait and in Iraq, and take no action to hinder the diplomatic and consular missions in the performance of their functions, including access to their nationals and the protection of their person and interests. Reminds all states that they are obliged to observe strictly Resolution 661 through 666. Decides to consult urgently to take further concrete measures as soon as possible under Chapter 7 of the Charter in response to Iraq's continued violation of the Charter of Resolutions of the Council and of international law. Unacceptable actions in violation of the integrity of diplomatic premises and personnel. Ricardo Alarcon, September 16, 1990. At the outset, my delegation wishes to express its appreciation to the delegation of France for the position it took in the negotiations that led to the resolution that we have just adopted, for its willingness to seek compromise formulations that made it possible for all members of the Council to support the resolution we have just approved. I must, however, say that, unfortunately, the resolution we have just adopted contains some elements on which I must comment. Above all, the text reaffirms some resolutions in respect to which our position is not changed by the vote we have just cast. The vote should not be interpreted as reflecting the change in our position. In our view, Resolution 665 violates the United Nations Charter, and Resolution 666, adopted only 2 days ago, contains approaches and criteria that are, in our judgment, of an inhuman character. My delegation would have preferred different wording in the same paragraphs of the text we have just adopted, where reference is made to aggressive acts. The wording here seems to be somewhat excessive. Such expressions were not used even in Resolution 660, referring to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We are also concerned about paragraph 6 of the operative section, since it might be inferred that some powers could use its provision to exacerbate the conflict and press on to military action. We regret that no reference is made in this text to the need to continue the efforts to find a peaceful solution to the conflicts. We regret also that no space was found to mention the responsibility and functions in connection with the diplomatic missions in Kuwait that can and should devolve upon the Secretary General. My delegation decided nevertheless to vote in favor of this resolution because we agree with the major elements of the operative part. We regard as absolutely unacceptable the actions in violation of the integrity of diplomatic premises and personnel in Kuwait. For Cuba, the respect for and full implementation of Security Council resolutions 662 and 664 remains an imperative necessity. Our vote should also be understood as an expression of the friendship, respect for France, Canada, and other countries whose diplomatic personnel and missions have been and are the object of actions and incidents that Cuba can only reject. So, basically excellent 50 pages, basically. U.S. hands off the Middle East. Cuba speaks out to the United Nations. We just, basically, the U.S. government, it does whatever it wants. They're Yankee butchers, racist butchers and rapist butchers of Yankee imperialism. And that's all they do. They do whatever they want. And they, basically ignore all UN charters, all UN statements. Everything else is just, it's just all the world is our playing field. All of the world is our backyard. All of the world is our property. So the bombs and missiles, the genocidal technology is all okay. So remember, please join me tomorrow for the U.S. hands off the Middle East. It'll be another, it'll be another one day, and then we're finished with that book. And then we're going to start this book, Hope and Folly, the United States and UNESCO, 1945 to 1985. Excellent book, 350 pages on press fabrications. Press fabrications, lies, deceit. U.S. press, mass media, academia, fraud, liars, and deceitful, propagandists, a state censorship system, a state disinformation campaign. So please join me for that. And then I'm going to just finish with the comments, just summarizing. Again, the Google Drive link PDF will be in the description section. Remember, Donald Trump needs to be in the ICJ. He is a war criminal. He is a genocidal butcher. He is a Yankee imperialist butcher. And he is a Yankee, murderer of, Hispanics, blacks, and Muslims. That is what Donald Trump is. He is a candidate for an ICJ appointment, and he is a candidate for an arrest warrant so that he is not allowed to travel to his casinos in Europe. I know that's difficult for Donald Trump to understand, but he is a war criminal that needs to be imprisoned in the ICJ. Next is that the ICJ, unfortunately, is a corrupt and, European fraud organization centered in Portugal, the Netherlands, The Hague. It is a place of colonialism. The most brutal regime of colonialism was in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau by the Portuguese colonial fascists. It was the most brutal and corrupt colonial regime. So placing a Hague in the Hague, Netherlands as the place for an ICJ International Court is obviously a racist European fraud organization of liars and propagandists. Again, UNESCO, we're going to talk about more. Get out, Yankee. You're not wanted in UNESCO. You're not requested. You're a pretentious group of fraud liars, Western colonial butchers that don't deserve to be in UNESCO. You're a Yankee butcher. You're a Yankee butcher, a Yankee rapist, and someone who should not be in UNESCO. You have no business being an organization with such large numbers of people and with such large numbers of, third world promotion. You're trying to remove literacy, remove food equality, and remove medical care. We talked about Nicolas Maduro, the kidnapping, another criminal action. Cuba's blockade. Yankee, stay away from Cuba. Otherwise, the ICJ will arrest your president. Okay, stay away from Cuba. The ICJ will arrest your racist butcher Yankee. And finally, we talked about, the trickster Yankee and censorship press. It's basically a trickster Yankee and censorship press that just, peddles the lies, peddles the garbage. We're going to have more information on that in, a day or two. And then we went through the, the funny, kind of statements about the press. I'm going to just read the ethics quiz. Racism and deceit in the U.S. press is morally acceptable. True, false, Washington's answer. Always true, racism and deceit is perfectly, acceptable behavior morally. Racism and lying are morally encouraged in press articles. U.S. government, definitely it's false. Racism and lying are not morally encouraged in press articles, but in the United States, they are. In the American press, yes, they're morally encouraged. And American press is quality moral action because it provides the maximum number of fabrications. Again, another fraud statement. American press is not quality morally because it provides the maximum number of fabrication. It is a, fabricating press. The Yankee press is Pulitzer Prize winning because con artists thrive. And I would say that's definitely true. The Yankee press is Pulitzer Prize, gives con artists the ability to thrive in it. And finally, it is ethical to have a racist press fabricate anti-Americanism. Again, false. That is false. It is, not, okay to have a racist press. The U.S. mass media uses racist fraud as its fundamental ethical principle. Again, another funny joke. Obviously it's the truth. That is what they use. The racist fraud is their fundamental principle of ethics. That is why it is a state censorship system of frauds. The New York Times, Washington Post, and Newsweek are ethically good journalism because they encourage fabrication of data. So again, another, true statement. They are ethically bad journalism, but it's a false statement because they do encourage fabrication of data, and that is why they are ethically fraudulent journalism. It is a false statement. The American press is quality ethical fraud. I mean, that's definitely true. Definitely true. The American press is quality ethical fraud. Fabricating numbers and YouTube views to promote a racist fraud perspective is quality ethics. So again, yes, that's not true. It is not quality ethics to promote statistical fraud. It is ethical press action to fabricate things about competitor countries for the sake of prestige. So obviously that's not true. That's not true. And we talked about the literacy and all of the medical issues. So again, please join me tomorrow for the last, section of the book. I will be back on, the next day for the Hope and Folly. Please download the PDF. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank and Delray Beach. Have a great day.